The laughter hit before his words even registered. My brother stood in my kitchen with a wine glass dangling from his fingers, and I watched him survey my apartment like a critic at a museum. "It's literally a shoebox," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. My mother froze mid-conversation. An uncle coughed. My cousin's eyes widened. And me. I stood there with my keys still in my hand, feeling the temperature of the room drop. He wasn't done. "I mean, I love you, but seriously, how do you even fit furniture in here?" The laughter came from the people who loved me. They laughed because he'd made it sound funny. Because discomfort wrapped in humor feels safe. I felt my face burn, but I did what I'd been trained to do since childhood. I smiled. I made a self-deprecating joke. I absorbed the humiliation so everyone else could stay comfortable. But something shifted in that moment. Not anger. Not yet. Awareness. I noticed how confident he felt, humiliating me in my own home. How safe he believed he was doing it. I realized the joke wasn't actually about my apartment. It was about my place in the family. And he thought that place was fixed. Permanent. He kept talking, but I stopped listening. I was watching instead. Watching how no one challenged him. How my mother busied herself with plates. How the room bent toward his comfort and away from mine. And I understood something in that silence. I had spent years making myself smaller so my brother could feel bigger. That night was the beginning of me stopping. After everyone left, my apartment felt suffocating. I replayed his words over and over. His tone. Timing. That wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated. I remembered other moments. Him joking about my finances, casually mentioning his success while implying I was struggling. Each time the family laughed. Each time I stayed silent and smiled. I'd convinced myself for years that his comments were harmless, that I was too sensitive. But that night sitting alone I let that story die. Silence has a way of sharpening memory. I realized his confidence wasn't based on anything real. It was based on permission. Permission I'd been giving him my entire life by staying silent. I thought about why he needed me smaller to feel bigger. About what he relied on. Assumptions, habits, and the family's refusal to question him. That's when I decided something had to change. Not revenge. Not yet. Just change. The next morning I looked at my brother differently. Not with anger, with clarity. I started remembering the architecture of how he'd been treated our whole lives. Growing up, my brother was always framed as the sensitive one. The one who needed help. The one everyone worried about. I was the responsible one, expected to figure things out on my own. That dynamic never evolved. Just aged. When he needed a place to stay years ago, the family mobilized. Connections were made. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Arrangements were quietly smoothed over. No one asked him hard questions. No one checked if he was taking responsibility seriously. I'd never needed that kind of rescue, so I was never offered it. When I faced financial struggles in my 20s, I solved them alone. When I needed advice, I figured it out. And the family praised me for being independent. They never asked if I was lonely. They never offered help I hadn't specifically requested. That imbalance sat under everything, unspoken but powerful. It shaped how we all moved around each other. He learned he could rely on the family to catch him. I learned I had to catch myself. And when he made jokes about my apartment, about my choices, about my life, the family laughed because they'd already decided his narrative was true. He was the struggling one. I was the capable one. He deserved sympathy. I deserved admiration for needing nothing. After the shoebox comment, I finally let myself acknowledge something I'd known for years. It wasn't just about words. It was about permission. He'd been given permission to take and take. I'd been given permission to give and give. And I was done. I started asking questions. Casual ones at first. I called my mother and asked about my brother's living situation. How long had he been in that apartment? How much was his rent? She told me what I already suspected. His rent was incredibly cheap for the area. "He's so lucky," she said. "He found this place years ago and the landlord never raised it. He barely pays anything." Lucky. That's what they called it. Not what it actually was, which was an agreement that had become outdated, protected only by silence and the family's collective decision not to question it. I started remembering details I'd heard at family gatherings over the years. A relative mentioning how long it had been since the rent changed. Someone else casually referencing an old agreement with the landlord. An uncle mentioning the landlord's name, Ms. Chen, and how she was fair but strict about rules. Ms. Chen. I remembered her now. Quiet at family gatherings. Observant. Not impressed by family drama. She valued clarity, boundaries. The kind of person who probably kept detailed records and followed through on what she said she would do. I wasn't plotting yet. I was just remembering. But the pieces were starting to align in my mind. My brother's entire sense of superiority was built on something fragile, an agreement that was never meant to last forever. He'd built a life on that foundation without realizing it was cracking. That's when I understood something crucial. I didn't need to orchestrate anything. I just needed to stop protecting him from reality. I sat with this realization for days. I knew what I needed to do, but I wanted to be sure I was doing it for the right reasons. Not revenge. Not humiliation. But honesty. So I decided to start with my brother directly. Called him and asked if we could talk. He agreed, probably thinking it was nothing serious. We met at a coffee shop near his apartment. I was nervous, but I was also clear. "I need to talk about what happened at the gathering," I said. "When you called my apartment a shoebox." He laughed. "Oh, come on. That was a joke. You're being too sensitive." "It was humiliating," I said quietly. "And it wasn't the first time. You've been making comments like that for years, and I've let it slide because I didn't want to create conflict. But I can't do that anymore." He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "I was just teasing. That's what brothers do." "No," I said. "Teasing is playful. What you do is cruel. And you do it in front of people specifically so they'll laugh at me instead of with me." He didn't respond well. He got defensive. He said I was overreacting. He said the family laughed because they knew I was capable enough to handle a little ribbing. He turned it around, made it about my sensitivity instead of his cruelty. That's when I knew talking to him wasn't going to change anything. He wasn't interested in understanding how his words affected me. He was interested in defending his right to say them. But something important had happened. I'd spoken the truth out loud. And I'd done it calmly, without anger, without aggression. I'd given him a chance to understand and to change. He'd chosen not to. Now I would proceed with what I'd been planning. I didn't contact Ms. Chen immediately. Timing mattered. First, I needed to make sure I had my facts straight. I started researching rental laws in our area. I looked up what fair market rent was for apartments like my brother's. I found public records about property values and lease agreements. Everything I discovered confirmed what I'd suspected. His rent was significantly below market rate. Years below market rate. I also started paying attention in a different way. At the next family gathering, I listened more carefully. I asked neutral questions in neutral tones. Never in the same conversation, never with the same person. I didn't take notes. I didn't act like I was investigating. I just listened. A cousin mentioned casually that she tried to find an apartment in the same building as my brother, and it was way more expensive now. An uncle referenced how old agreements from years ago were sometimes overlooked in lease reviews. Someone else mentioned that Ms. Chen was very professional about these things. People love to fill silence. I filled it by listening instead of talking. I felt strangely steady through all of this. For years, I'd felt smaller around my brother. Uncertain. Like I had to justify my life and my choices. Now I was stepping out of that fog. I was seeing clearly. And clarity felt like power. Not the kind that comes from hurting someone, but the kind that comes from understanding the truth. I wasn't gathering this information to weaponize it. I was gathering it so I could speak honestly. There's a difference, and that difference mattered to me. Before I reached out to Ms. Chen, I rehearsed what I would say. Not manipulation. Not accusation. Just clarity. I planned to remind her of a conversation she'd mentioned about reviewing the lease terms. I would provide accurate information about how long the rent had remained unchanged. Frame it as helpful, not accusatory. Everything I would say would be true. I wasn't exaggerating or lying. I was simply bringing attention to what was factually the case, that an old agreement had never been revisited. What Ms. Chen did with that information was entirely her decision. If she decided the rent was fair, that was her right. If she decided to conduct a market review, that was also her right. I wasn't forcing anything. I was providing information she'd already expressed interest in having. I knew what would probably happen. Landlords review leases. It's normal business. And when Ms. Chen reviewed my brother's lease, she would discover it was significantly below market rate. She would likely adjust it. My brother would face consequences for years of living in an outdated agreement. Not because I'd sabotaged him, but because reality had finally caught up. I rehearsed my tone. Calm, professional, no edge. Just someone reminding another person of something they'd mentioned before. I waited 2 weeks before reaching out. I didn't want to seem rushed or reactive. I wanted to seem like I was simply being helpful. I found Ms. Chen's contact information and sent her an email. It was brief, respectful, and honest. Dear Ms. Chen, I hope this email finds you well. I'm reaching out because I remembered you mentioning to my family that you'd been meaning to conduct a lease review for the property where my brother lives. I wanted to remind you about that conversation, as I know you're very thorough about these matters. I also wanted to let you know that I believe his current lease has been in place for quite a long time without adjustment. I thought that information might be helpful as you consider your property management. Thank you for your time. Best regards. My name. That was it. Not aggressive. Not accusatory. Just a helpful reminder from a family member. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The response came 3 days later. Ms. Chen wrote back professionally. She thanked me for the reminder and noted that she had indeed been meaning to conduct a comprehensive lease review. She asked if I had any specific information about the current rental agreement timeline. I provided her with the accurate information I'd gathered. How long the rent had remained the same. Market comparisons. Everything factual. Nothing exaggerated. She responded with a simple acknowledgement and said she would be conducting a full review of her properties. She also mentioned that adjustments would be made where they were warranted, and that she always treated these matters with fairness and professionalism. I sat back and let that sink in. This was happening. Not because I'd manipulated anyone, but because I'd told the truth. And truth, once spoken, has its own momentum. Weeks passed. Life went on normally. My brother didn't know anything was coming. The family continued as they always did. But I was different. I was calm in a way I'd never been before. At the next family gathering, my brother was as loud and confident as ever. He made jokes about people's career choices. He talked about his apartment like it was a prize he'd won through intelligence. He made another subtle comment about my life choices, and I smiled politely without absorbing the sting. I watched him closely. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already shifting. There was something surreal about being the only person in the room who knew. Not in a smug way, in a sobering way. I wasn't excited about what was coming. I wasn't rubbing my hands together in anticipation of his pain. I was just quiet, observant, aware. I realized something important during this time. True power isn't loud. It's not performative. It's quiet and already in motion before anyone notices. Real strength comes from knowing your own mind and trusting your own path. My brother had been loud his whole life because he needed the noise to feel real. I didn't need noise anymore. I also realized something else. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this because I couldn't keep protecting him from natural consequences. He'd built his superiority on an unstable foundation, and eventually, all unstable things collapse. I was just removing myself from the effort of holding it up. One evening I got a call from the family group chat. Ms. Chen had sent notices to all her tenants about upcoming lease reviews. My brother's name was on the list. He called me that evening. His voice was tight. No laughter. No confidence. "Hey, did you hear about this lease review thing?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "I saw it in the group chat," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It's weird, right? I mean, why would she suddenly want to do a full review now?" I could hear the panic under his casual tone. He was trying to locate the problem without admitting there was one. He was trying to figure out what had changed. "These things happen," I said quietly. "Landlords review leases. It's normal business practice." "Yeah, but it's been fine for years," he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping in. "Why change things now? Do you think she's planning to raise the rent?" I didn't answer the question directly. I just said, "I guess you'll find out when the review is complete." After the call, I felt something unfamiliar, relief. Not because he was suffering, but because the dynamic had shifted. For once, I wasn't reacting to him. He was reacting to circumstances. The family hadn't intervened yet. No one had started smoothing things over. Reality was speaking first. The rent increase notice came 2 weeks later. My brother didn't call me this time. He called the family group chat. The number wasn't just symbolic. It was substantial. Years of stagnation corrected at once. His rent was tripling. Not doubling. Tripling. The family group chat exploded with messages. Sympathy. Suggestions. My mother immediately offered financial help. An uncle said it was unfair and sudden. Everyone mobilized to support him just like they always did. But something was different this time. Someone asked why the rent hadn't changed in so long. Another person wondered aloud if maybe it was actually fair that it adjusted now. A cousin asked practical questions about the lease terms. The narrative my brother had controlled for years started slipping. The story of him as the lucky one finding an amazing deal transformed into a story about him living in an outdated agreement that had finally caught up with reality. I stayed silent, not hiding, just observing, watching how quickly people's responses shifted when they actually thought about the situation instead of just reacting emotionally. My brother tried to frame it as sudden and unfair. He skipped over the fact that it had been avoided for years. He made it sound like Ms. Chen was being unreasonable, when really she was just conducting normal business. But the more details that emerged, the weaker his story sounded. Facts have weight. And once people start asking questions, stories without strong foundations fall apart. At the next family gathering, my brother's eyes landed on me. Not openly, but in pauses and sideways looks. He suspected I knew more than I was saying. He wasn't wrong. He tried subtle guilt first, appealing to family loyalty and shared history. I responded with calm neutrality. I didn't deny or confirm anything. That unsettled him more than a fight would have. Confrontation would have let him play the victim. I didn't give him that stage. Instead, I watched the family adjust to a new reality where his comfort was no longer guaranteed. People were asking him questions instead of immediately offering help. They were expecting him to handle problems like an adult. My brother had never learned to handle disappointment. Everything had always been smoothed over. Now his safety net was fraying. Eventually, my brother decided to confront Ms. Chen directly. That was his error. He went to her apartment, emotional and defensive. He argued that the increase was unfair. He talked about the history of their arrangement. He appealed to her sympathy instead of discussing terms like an adult. Ms. Chen responded with professionalism, not sympathy. She explained that rental adjustments are standard practice and that his current rent was significantly below market rate. She was polite but firm. When my brother relayed the conversation to the family, his story sounded thinner than before. Details didn't line up. He contradicted himself. People started asking harder questions. The same people who once laughed at his jokes now listened more carefully to what he wasn't saying. I said nothing. The less I spoke, the more noticeable it became that I didn't need to. Truth doesn't need a spokesperson, just needs to be visible. When someone finally asked me directly what I knew, I didn't dramatize or defend myself. I explained only what I'd verified. I reached out to Ms. Chen, I said calmly. I reminded her that she'd mentioned wanting to do a lease review. I provided her with accurate information about how long your brother's rent had remained unchanged. Everything I told her was true. What she did with that information was entirely her decision as a landlord. The room shifted. His story relied on outrage. Mine relied on facts. The contrast was sharp. You contacted his landlord? My mother asked, shocked. I provided factual information, I said. Ms. Chen is a professional. She conducts business according to market standards. That's not my doing. That's just how property management works. I wasn't angry when I said it. I wasn't triumphant. I was just clear. And clarity in that moment was more powerful than any emotional display. I watched the family process this. Some people nodded like it made sense. Others looked uncomfortable. But no one challenged me. And no one immediately rushed to my brother's defense the way they once would have. The hierarchy had quietly recalibrated. Once the reality of the situation settled in, old memories started resurfacing. People began connecting dots they'd ignored for years. Remember when he asked for money that one time and we all pitched in? An uncle said thoughtfully. And then he never paid any of us back. And when he needed a place to stay, we all made calls for him, my mother added quietly. But when she needed help, we just told her she was capable. It wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations or confrontations. It was just quiet realization spreading through the family like water finding cracks. People were finally looking at the patterns they'd been enabling. I stayed calm through all of it, resisting the urge to explain myself further or point out what I'd noticed. I didn't need to. The truth had momentum now. People were seeing it on their own. What surprised me most wasn't my brother's discomfort. It was how quickly the family adjusted once denial was no longer convenient. People are capable of tremendous growth when truth becomes unavoidable. My brother noticed the shift in how the family treated him. He was no longer the protected one. He was the questioned one. And he had no idea how to navigate that. A few weeks later, he caught me alone after a family dinner. His voice was lowered, confidence stripped to urgency. I'm struggling with this rent thing, he said. Can you help me figure out how to handle it? He wasn't apologizing. He was asking for rescue, just like he always had. When he finished, I said no. Toughly, clearly, without anger. I didn't cause this situation, I told him. I provided accurate information to your landlord about a lease that was outdated. What happened after is the natural consequence of how business works. You need to handle this yourself. He stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was anymore. I wasn't the quiet buffer he'd depended on. I wasn't absorbing his problems. I was standing firm with boundaries. This isn't fair, he said quietly. No, but it's real. You've been living on a foundation that was always going to shift. Now it's shifting. That's not something I did to you. He left without another word. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction but peace. At the next family gathering, my brother asked for help. Not directly. He hinted at financial strain. He suggested the rent increase was unfair. He implied he might need temporary assistance. The family listened. And then they did something unexpected. They offered advice instead of rescue. Maybe you could look for a different apartment, my mother suggested gently. Or pick up additional work, an uncle said. That's what most people do when their circumstances change. You're capable, I said quietly. You've just never had to prove it before. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. And for the first time, the family was being honest with my brother instead of enabling him. He didn't get the safety net he'd come to expect. Not because we abandoned him, but because we stopped carrying him. There's a difference, and that difference is important. The shift was subtle but permanent. My brother had to adapt. He had to grow up. And the family had to adjust to a new dynamic, one where everyone was expected to handle their own challenges. Over the following months, my brother changed. The jokes stopped. The casual superiority vanished. He wasn't cruel anymore, just exposed. Vulnerable in a way he'd never been forced to be before. I watched him adjust, and I didn't feel joy in his discomfort. Felt clarity. For years, I'd mistaken his confidence for strength. Now I understood it had been borrowed. Conditional. Built on a foundation that was never meant to last. I realized how much space I'd given up to preserve peace. How much of myself I'd made small so he could feel big. I wasn't doing that anymore. Not just with my brother but with anyone. There's a power in deciding that your own dignity matters more than other people's comfort. It's quiet power. It doesn't announce itself. But once you claim it, you can't unsee it. My brother looked at me differently now. Not with contempt but with something like respect. Or maybe just honest recognition that I wasn't the person he'd always assumed I was. Weeks later, I invited him over to my apartment. The same small space he'd called a shoebox. Same furniture. Same layout. No explanations offered. No grand gestures. He stood in my living room silent. No jokes. No commentary. The space hadn't changed, but the way he occupied it had. He moved more carefully. He looked around with something like awareness instead of judgment. I didn't fill the silence. I let it exist. That silence felt earned. Heavy. Honest. When he left, he thanked me. It wasn't an apology. Not directly. But it was close enough. It was him acknowledging that something had shifted between us. That I wasn't the person he could humiliate anymore. That I'd drawn a line and was standing behind it. I respect that you handled this the way you did, he said at the door. I don't like how it turned out for me, but I respect it. That was enough. I didn't need more. That night, I walked through my apartment slowly. The walls didn't feel small anymore. They felt intentional. Space isn't measured in square footage. It's measured in independence. In the ability to stand alone without shrinking. My apartment had never been small. My sense of self had just been smaller than it should have been. My brother's rent had tripled, but my sense of self had expanded infinitely more. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't embarrassed him publicly. I'd simply stopped absorbing disrespect. I'd spoken truth. Set boundaries. That was what created real change. My brother never formally apologized. I stopped waiting for it. Some people don't have the language for accountability. They learn it through experience. We became quieter around each other. More neutral. The tension eased not because we'd resolved everything, but because we'd both stopped pretending. He came to family gatherings without making jokes at my expense. Not because I'd forced him to, but because he'd learned about consequences. About respect. Healing doesn't always need closure conversations. Sometimes it just looks like boundaries finally being respected. I used to think power was dominance. Who spoke loudest? Who commanded attention? Who bent the room toward themselves? I was wrong. Power is stability. It's knowing you can stand alone without shrinking or posturing. It's having integrity even when no one's watching. It's being willing to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. It's refusing to absorb disrespect. I hadn't taken anything from my brother. I'd reclaimed myself. That distinction mattered profoundly. I'd removed myself from the machinery of his superiority. And without my participation, the machine fell apart. That's not revenge. That's just what happens when you stop volunteering to be small. The family adjusted to the new equilibrium quickly. Not because I demanded respect, but because I demonstrated through my actions that I deserved it. Respect followed quietly, naturally. It didn't feel forced because it wasn't. I'd won by standing still, by being honest, by refusing to play the game anymore. Family gatherings became calmer over time. Less performance, more honesty. I noticed people asking me questions they never had before. Listening longer. Taking my perspective seriously. The hierarchy flattened. Not declared. Just live. My brother was no longer the favored one protected from consequences. I was no longer the capable one expected to handle everything alone. We were just people, equals, trying to navigate family dynamics with a little more awareness than we'd had before. My apartment never changed, but my relationship to it transformed. It wasn't a shoebox anymore. It was a home, a space I'd built with my own hands, a reflection of who I was, someone capable, independent, and worthy of dignity. I thought sometimes about that moment in the kitchen when my brother had made his joke. How small I'd felt. How much I'd absorbed trying to keep the peace. And I understood that moment had been important. Not because it hurt but because it woke me up. My brother adjusted to his new rent. He took on additional work. He cut expenses. He adapted like people do when they have to. Life went on. I didn't celebrate his struggle. I didn't remind him of the past. I didn't keep score. Revenge had never been the point. Truth was. Timing was. Integrity was. I'd chosen dignity over spectacle. That choice stayed with me. Changed how I moved through the world. I stopped waiting for people to give me permission to matter. I stopped shrinking. I stopped absorbing disrespect. The shoebox comment faded into memory. Not because I forgot it, but because it mattered less and less. What mattered was that I'd responded to it with clarity instead of defensiveness. That I'd spoken truth instead of staying silent. That I'd set a boundary instead of absorbing shame. That response defined me more than his words ever could. My apartment is still small. My brother still makes more money than I do. He still has things I don't have. But the dynamic between us shifted. The power balance recalibrated. And I learned something that changed everything. Silence, when intentional, can be powerful. Respect doesn't need permission. The truth is patient. And there's a kind of strength that comes from standing alone. Not proudly, not loudly, but steadily. The shoebox stood firm because it was mine. And for the first time, so was my place in the family. I didn't win by being louder than my brother. I won by being clearer. By knowing who I was and refusing to make myself smaller. By speaking truth and letting it do its work without me having to control the outcome. That's the kind of victory that sticks. That's the kind of power that lasts. Not the kind that dominates someone else, but the kind that sets you free. My brother learned something too. He learned that confidence built on borrowed comfort is fragile. He learned that the people around you won't protect you from reality forever. He learned that respect is earned, not assumed. We're not close. We're probably never going to be. But we're honest with each other now. And that's more than we had before. The shoebox stands. And inside it I stand too. Smaller in space, larger in every other way that matters.